Julia Roberts, the smile that once melted the whole world. America's sweetheart, the symbol of love. Beauty and Hollywood's dazzling light for more than 3 decades. But behind that smile was not happiness, only a collection of wounds delicately hidden beneath a layer of red lipstick. She once shocked the world by calling off her wedding right before the ceremony, quietly slipping into a small church in Indiana, to marry in haste, only to have it fall apart in less than 2 years. Romantic love stories turned into ruins. Vows turned to ashes under the glare of flashing cameras. At the height of fame and glory, Julia Roberts remained the loneliest woman in Hollywood, a fragile heart worn down by loss and fractured relationships. And now at 57, the immortal icon of world cinema faces her most silent enemy, loneliness, the passing of loved ones and scars that no time can erase. What has made the woman with the brightest smile in the world learn to live with the darkness? To understand why the woman who once made the world believe in fairy tales must now live with wounds that will never heal. We have to return to where it all began, Julia's childhood, where her first light flickered amid the shadows of a broken family. Julia Fiona Roberts was born on October 28, 1967, in the small town of Smyrna, Georgia, a place of cracked red dirt roads and old wooden houses creaking in the rain, just like lives struggling to stay upright in the storm. The Roberts family home was far from luxurious moldy walls, a leaky tin roof, winter winds seeping through wooden slats, forcing 3 children to huddle together on an old bed for warmth. Her parents, Walter and Betty Lou, were both actors-dreamers in the conservative American South. They bravely opened the first acting school in the area that welcomed both black and white children, an act so courageous it earned the admiration of Martin Luther King Jr. But their courage in the public eye could not save them from the storm inside their own home. Money was scarce, artistic dreams traded for piles of unpaid bills, and arguments often stretched till dawn. When Julia was just 4 years old, the marriage fell apart. Her father left, leaving behind a little girl with wide brown eyes, staring into an empty, cold room. Later, her mother remarried Michael Mose, and the fragile home grew even darker. Shouting matches, slamming doors, muffled cries swallowed into pillows each night. Neighbors said the police had been called more than once. Julia, her brother Eric, and her sister Lisa learned to walk softly, speak softly, even breathe softly, as if one wrong sound could make everything explode. Little Julia also struggled with a stutter, every word caught in her throat, trembling with fear. At school, she was the quiet child, withdrawn, always sitting in the corner, avoiding eye contact. At home, silence was the only way to survive. Then, when she was 10, tragedy struck. Her gentle father, the only safe harbor, she had died of throat cancer. He hid his illness, and even his death, to spare his daughter fear. Before passing, he left behind a few cassette tapes, recordings of bedtime stories he used to tell. In the nights that followed, Julia curled up under her blanket-pressed play and listened to his voice echo through the damp darkness, that warm, soothing voice now trapped in magnetic tape. She held the recorder as if it were his hand, replaying it over and over until the tape broke, as if by doing so, she could keep him with her a little longer. School did not save her from loneliness. Classmates mocked her radiant smile, calling her fangy. The smile that would later light up all of Hollywood once made her bow her head in shame. Yet in that darkness, a quiet flame began to burn. Acting became both her escape and her salvation. From broken speech exercises to small amateur performances, she learned to turn pain into emotion, silence into words. In 1985, she left Georgia with a few $100s and a small suitcase, stepping into the biting cold of New York City. The city did not welcome her. Her first apartment was a cramped room with a broken heater and cracked walls. At night, she slept in her coat. She survived on instant noodles rationing meals to get through each day. Endless casting calls ended with cold rejections, more than 200 of them. And on snowy nights, Julia would trudge home, her breath turning to mist under the dim yellow streetlights. But she kept whispering her vow to herself, try again. Then one day, a fleeting smile in a Clarisil commercial earned her the first union card, the tiny ticket into the dream world she had longed for. No one knew that behind that smile lay a childhood full of scars, a heart once shattered, but one that never stopped beating. In 1987, on a cold gray morning in Chicago, Julia Roberts stepped onto the set of Crime Story, her first ever television role, appearing in just one episode. She had a fever, her body trembling, yet she still put on makeup and walked in front of the camera. Sweat mixed with the heat of the studio lights, and a small accident involving smoke effects left burns on her skin, real scars mirroring the invisible wounds she had carried since childhood. She didn't give up. Discipline was her armor, resilience was her weapon. Standing on the thin line between poverty and ambition, she chose survival. Her tiny New York apartment was empty. Only a few packets of noodles remained in the kitchen, and the cold seeped through every crack in the door. In her hand, she held her only treasure, her father's old watch. The metal had been polished bright by the grip of her hand every night she missed him. But hunger doesn't wait. With trembling fingers, she slid the watch across the pawn shop counter. As the clerk counted the money indifferently, her tears fell onto the face of the watch, blurring the time. She felt as though she had lost her father all over again. Years later, when she had become a star, Julia searched for and bought back that watch. She never wore it as jewelry, but as a scar turned into a symbol, a reminder that she had survived and that she had never forgotten. In 1988 came Mystic Pizza, a small, low-budget film set in a windy seaside town. But from the very first frame, Julia appeared like a flame. Roger Ebert called her a beauty with fierce energy, a prophecy for the legend soon to come. In 1989, Steel Magnolias. She played Shelby, a young bride suffering from a terminal illness, a fragile role demanding extraordinary emotional support. She was not the first choice. On set, there were days she cried alone in the dressing room, doubted and underestimated. Yet she turned those tears into fuel. Julia poured every memory of abandonment, loss, and mockery into Shelby and created a performance so raw the entire set fell silent. At only 22, she won a Golden Globe and earned her first Oscar nomination. The wounds that once nearly broke her now became the very material of her art. Out of hunger, cold, and rejection, she emerged carrying something no one could extinguish: the fire of life. In 1990, a script called Pretty Woman, originally a dark story without a fairy tale ending, seemed doomed after the production company went bankrupt. The project appeared buried. Julia had to audition again one more time. Richard Gere, the leading man, was still uncertain until Julia smiled and handed him a piece of paper with just 3 words written on it: "Please say yes." He nodded, and in that moment, film history began. Julia came to the set as an unknown girl in cheap shoes, but when the cameras rolled, the world fell silent. In that blazing red dress with eyes shining and the smile once mocked on a schoolyard now lighting up millions of hearts, she became unforgettable. Pretty Woman grossed hundreds of millions of dollars, transforming Julia Roberts into America's sweetheart. Women imitated her style, couples began believing in love again, and Beverly Hills turned into a pilgrimage site. From a damp apartment in New York, she walked straight into legend. But fame, like any flame, also burns. The pressure, the relentless press, and the constant flash of cameras fractured her love life. Her engagement to Dylan McDermott vanished like smoke. She would later confess, "The whole world loves me, but sometimes I feel like I belong to no one." Julia threw herself into new roles as a way of running from herself, from pain, from loneliness. Sleeping with the Enemy, a survivor of abuse. Dying Young, a love story in the shadow of illness. And Spielberg's Hook, a world of magic that couldn't heal the exhaustion behind the scenes. Each role left another scar, but she kept going. She understood that beauty was never a gift. It was a battle. And Julia Roberts fought for every smile, every tear, every frame that the world could never forget. By the late 1990s, Julia Roberts was no longer just the girl from Pretty Woman. She was the queen of romantic comedies, the icon adored by millions. My Best Friend's Wedding, 1997, shattered conventions, giving her a role both intelligent and vulnerable, calculating yet profoundly human. Audiences saw in her not just a star, but a real person, imperfect, but sincere. Notting Hill, 1999, blurred the line between art and life, as Julia played a famous actress falling for an ordinary man. It wasn't just a role, it was a reflection of her own longing for peace amid the storm of fame. Runaway Bride reunited her with Richard Gere, rekindling the spark that once electrified the screen and turning them into Hollywood's golden couple. Those films weren't just successes, they became memories for an entire generation, making Julia's smile a universal language of love. Then came the year 2000, and with it her defining role, Erin Brockovich, a single mother, ordinary yet unyielding in the face of power. Gone were the glamorous layers of makeup. Julia appeared raw, stubborn, fierce, and radiant. She became the first woman in Hollywood history to earn a $20 million salary. Once a young actress paid less than her male co-star in Pretty Woman, now she had turned the tables. The role brought her not only a Golden Globe and Oscar and $250 million in box office success, but also a victory for all women, proof that talent deserves its worth. When she stepped onto the stage to accept her Oscar, she smiled through tears and said, "I'm just a girl from Smyrna, Georgia, and I'm standing here." That sentence rang out like vindication, closing every doubt and opening the most glorious chapter of her career. By 2001, her films had grossed billions, making Julia Roberts one of the most powerful stars in cinematic history. But her true legacy wasn't in the numbers. It lay in the journey from a little girl trudging through snow in worn-out shoes, pawning her father's watch, to survive to a woman standing at the summit rewriting Hollywood's rules. Julia Roberts was no longer just America's sweetheart. She had become a symbol of resilience, a living testament that the deepest wounds can shine into healing light. Her smile wasn't just beautiful, it was a scar turned to gold. Yet behind that smile, Julia's heart still wrestled to find peace. Her love life, like her roles, was always beautiful, but fragile. Broken engagements, fractured promises, and the cruel lesson that love beneath the spotlight of fame can fade even faster than it blooms. In the early years of her career, she found a brief moment of peace in Liam Neeson, and the calm, gentle man who soothed the storm inside a young woman just emerging from poverty. Their love was short-lived, but intense, like a streak of light across the sky, leaving in her the realization that love could be both a shelter and a storm. That feeling seeped into every role she would later play, from the aching gaze of Shelby to the luminous smile of Vivian Ward. Then came Dylan McDermott, a love that seemed written by fate, arriving just as she stood at the threshold of glory. They got engaged quickly, reaching for stability amid the whirlwind of fame. But Hollywood does not tolerate peace. The paparazzi swarmed intimate dinners, and the news turned into screaming headlines, and the engagement ring became a symbol of loss. Within a year, the dream dissolved. Julia learned the bitter paradox to be adored by the whole world, yet never truly belong to anyone. It was her first lesson, and not her last, that the love of America's most famous woman always came with a price. When the cameras stopped rolling and the lights went out, Julia returned to silence. Her heart still cracked, but the light in her eyes never dimmed. In the early 1990s, Julia Roberts' career soared like a kite catching the wind. Pretty Woman had made her America's muse. Her smile lit up Billboard's magazine covers and millions of hearts. To the world, it seemed she had everything: fame, beauty, money, and power. But behind the luxurious velvet curtain of Hollywood, her heart was quietly writing a different story. Not one about glamour, but about the fragile faith in love, the very thing she had longed for since she was a lost little girl in a leaking house in Georgia. At the center of that story was actor Kiefer Sutherland, charming, unpredictable, and irresistibly magnetic. Together, they became Hollywood's golden couple. Their laughter echoed on film sets, on red carpets, and cozy dinners meant for two. To the world, it looked like destiny. To Julia, it felt like her last hope for a real home. The wedding was planned down to the tiniest detail: gold-embossed invitations, an ivory gown that shimmered white flowers filling the aisle, and a guest list so star-studded it made all of Hollywood pause. Newspapers reported on it daily, and fans counted down the hours to what was being called the wedding of the century. Yet amidst the laughter, the photos, and the blessings, Julia grew quieter during her dress fittings. She smiled gently at her reflection, but her eyes seemed far away. To her, the wedding wasn't about proving love to the world. It was about finding peace, something her broken childhood had stolen. She told friends she would write her own vows, not for the cameras, not for the press, but for him and for her own heart. But as with every fairy tale under Hollywood's lights, the magic began to crack. As June 1991 approached, the whispers grew louder. Rumors of betrayal of Kiefer's secret affair were spreading through Hollywood nights out of two souls slowly drifting apart under the weight of fame. Both remained silent, but the noise around them became deafening. And then, just 3 days before the wedding, the world had been waiting for her. Julia did the unthinkable. She walked away. The shock rippled through Hollywood like an earthquake. The wedding dress still hung on its rack, the altar still glowed with flowers, but the bride was gone, began to wilt. The wedding music never played, and joy turned to sorrow. The tabloids screamed, speculated, condemned. But in the middle of the chaos, Julia stayed silent. Alone in an empty room, she was no longer a star, no longer America's sweetheart, just a young woman, sitting on the floor, staring at the cold ring on the table, listening to her heartbeat echo in the heavy stillness. Later, Julia would say, "Leaving was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was the only right thing." And Kiefer years later admitted that Julia had been braver than him, brave enough to walk away from something that no longer felt true. No blame, no bitterness, just two people who once loved each other, standing at the crossroads where love could no longer survive. The canceled wedding was not an ending. It was a beginning of pain and of rebirth. From that upheaval, Julia stepped onto the screen with eyes that were utterly transformed, deeper, more truthful, carrying a wound the audience could feel even if they couldn't see it. In Sleeping with the Enemy, She embodied a woman escaping abuse, a trembling, hauntingly authentic performance that made the world believe she was reliving her own fears. In dying young, her gaze carried tenderness and loss, as if every line had been written from memory. And so the unworn gown, the altar that never witnessed vows, the bells that never rang, all became legend. The world might remember that cancelled wedding as a scandal. But for Julia, it was the moment she found herself not in ruin, but in resilience, not in bitterness, but in grace. She had been wounded beneath the brightest lights, but she refused to let that define her. Julia Roberts, for the woman who once stood beneath an arch of flowers, waiting for vows that would never be spoken, walked away carrying the scars of love and transforming them into art. She learned that strength does not come from what is complete, but from the courage to let go when your heart tells you it's time. And from that moment on, every role, every smile, every triumph she achieved carried within it the echo of that fateful day. The day Julia Roberts, beneath Hollywood's brightest lights, chose silence instead of saying, "I do." In 1993, an unexpected turning point left. All of Hollywood stunned. Julia Roberts, America's beauty, the symbol of love and strength, quietly stepped away from the cameras, slipped into a small church in Indiana, and exchanged vows with country singer Lyle Lovett. There was no lavish wedding, no jeweled gown, just her in a simple white dress and him in cowboy boots. It was a private, fleeting, and so heartbreakingly genuine moment that few could believe it was real. The press called it a summer storm, a Hollywood shock, but to Julia, it wasn't an act. It was a fragile yet sincere attempt to find belonging. In that moment, she wasn't the queen of movie posters. She was a woman yearning to be loved, to find peace, to anchor herself to something real. The marriage was quiet, but short-lived. In less than 2 years, it ended in silence. No accusations, no bitterness. Julia and Lyle parted with mutual respect. Two artists who understood that sometimes the greatest courage lies in knowing when to let go. For Julia, it wasn't a failure. It was another lesson that loss isn't always an ending, but sometimes the beginning of a new chapter in the heart's search for truth. There were no children, no lasting home, only her and the stillness that followed. But instead of letting loneliness consume her, Julia chose to transform it. She turned pain into a gentle kind of armor, one that made her deeper, wiser, and even more hungry for real love. To the world, it was just another headline. To her, it was a pilgrimage of a soul still finding its way home. By the mid-1990s, Julia Roberts had lived through passionate romances that burned out too soon, a broken engagement, and a marriage that drifted away like the wind. She was still the biggest star on the planet, but behind that dazzling smile lay a weary heart. She once admitted, "I have everything, yet nowhere to come home to." And then, as if by fate, while filming The Mexican in 2000, Julia met Daniel Mulder, a cinematographer, not a celebrity, not a face on a movie poster. He stood behind the camera, calm, steady, and humble, a chaos surrounding her. When they met, Daniel was still married, and the storm of rumors broke instantly. The tabloids swarmed headlines, screamed speculation, soared. But Julia and Daniel stayed silent. They neither explained nor denied. They let time speak for them. And time proved its truth amid the noise and chaos. They found something rare: peace. Daniel saw in her not a star, but a human being. He loved Julia not for the famous smile, but for the fragility that hid beneath it. Their friendship grew quietly, slowly blossoming into love. 2 years later, on July 4th of 2002, Julia Roberts, the woman who had once shocked the world by calling off a wedding, walked down the aisle again, this time with no cameras and no red carpet. Only the wind in the sky and the scent of wild flowers filled the air at her small ranch in New Mexico. No journalists were invited. Even some close friends only learned afterward. Julia wore a simple dress. No crown, no choir, just whispered "I do" into the stillness. She was no longer America's sweetheart. She was a woman who had finally found her true home. With Daniel, Julia discovered what fame could never give her steadiness. "When the whole world looks at me as a star, he sees me as a person," she once said. And from that simplicity, she was reborn. Together, they built a life not dazzling, but enduring. In 2004, Julia welcomed twins Hazel and Phineas, followed by baby Henry in 2007. Amid children's laughter and the golden light of sunrise on her porch, Julia said the title, "I'm most proud of isn't actress, it's mother." At their Taos ranch, her life was no longer measured in box office numbers or magazine covers, but in warm breakfasts, sunlit afternoons, stretching across the yard, and peaceful evenings with her family. Daniel Malter, the man who once stood behind the camera, became her steady anchor, the one who turned her old wounds into calm. And so Julia Roberts' greatest role was not Vivian Ward or Erin Brockovich. It had no script, no director. That role was called real-life wife, mother, partner. The woman who once stood beneath the world's brightest lights, wounded by broken dreams, had now found happiness in quiet simplicity. The world had given her the crown of fame, but she chose instead the gentle light of home. And in that light, Julia Roberts finally understood what Hollywood, for all its glory, could never teach her, that sometimes the greatest victory in life is learning how to live in peace. In 2014, when her half-sister passed away, Julia carried within her a sorrow so deep that no words could reach it. There were no headlines, no noise, only a quiet shadow carved deep into her soul. Friends said she rarely spoke of it, choosing to keep it private, as if to protect both the memory of the one who was gone and her own fragile peace. But at night, when the ranch was still and her children fast asleep, that loss would return and sit quietly at the edge of the light like a shadow that refused to leave. It was a reminder that even the brightest smile can tremble, and that even a life filled with love cannot escape separation. That the heart endures not by avoiding pain, but by learning to hold both joy and sorrow at once. Between her and her brother, actor Eric Roberts, there had once been a long, aching distance. Since the mid-1990s, when she soared to stardom after Pretty Woman Eric had been battling his own demons, addiction, legal troubles, and the bitter comparisons the press never stopped drawing. Pride and misunderstanding hardened into silence. The siblings went their separate ways, each building a life that seemed to have no room for the other. But life in its quiet mercy offered them a bridge. In 2004, when Julia became a mother, Eric held her newborn twins for the first time, and something in him softened. Staring into those small, innocent faces, years of resentment began to dissolve. The past didn't disappear, but the wall between them cracked. The crack became a scar, and in the hollow of that scar, kinship returned. Julia realized that healing doesn't mean the pain is gone. It means learning to carry it with grace. If Hollywood once tried to define Julia by red carpets and box office numbers, it is these moments of reconciliation and remembrance that truly define her humanity. The star admired by the world still shines, but her light has changed gentler, now illuminated not just by fame, but by love, forgiveness, and the quiet courage to keep going, despite the empty spaces the heart can never fill. At 57, Julia Roberts no longer lives as merely a star, but as a woman who has weathered the storms, wears her scars with pride, and found a peaceful place to shine quietly, steadily, perhaps more deeply than ever before. She no longer races from one film set to another to prove she belongs. Her career now is a deliberate dance less, but precious, not a retreat, but a triumph. Every role she takes is a mirror reflecting an inner truth, and in a broader sense, the truth of us all. In August, Osage County, the image of a daughter breaking beneath the weight of a broken family wasn't just acting, it was memory refined into art. The Oscar nomination was recognition, but the real power lay in what audiences saw reflected in her eyes. You are not alone. With Homecoming, she stepped into television not to change direction, but to declare that her craft could never be confined to one medium. Ticket to Paradise reminded the world that joy is never shallow. Laughter, too, is strength. Leave the World Behind showed she could carry the anxieties of a fractured age. And as she looks ahead to After the Hunt, set for release in 2025, it is more than another milestone. It is a promise the fire, though calmer, now still burns bright. Beyond the screen, Julia has expanded her influence as a true storyteller. Through Red Arm Films, she champions projects she believes in, and as a longtime ambassador for Lancôme, she represents more than a brand. She embodies beauty matured through time. Even in the world of fine jewelry, she doesn't wear elegance. She embodies it understated sophistication, beauty that knows when to be silent. She stands at a rare intersection of cinema, fashion, and business, not to stay young, but to prove that reinvention can mean sustainability evolving without losing one's essence. The whispers about her health that have surfaced over the years were never confirmed nor denied. She lets her life speak for her, instead the steady rhythm of yoga palettes and swimming. Long walks along the beaches of Malibu or the fields near Taos. A disciplined, balanced diet. Sunscreen as a daily ritual. It isn't performance. It's the quiet pulse of someone who has learned to protect her peace after years of chaos. She guards her privacy fiercely, showing the world her work, but not her wounds. Her smile, but not her scars. And it is precisely that privacy that shapes the sanctuary she now protects, where children's laughter mingles with the scent of sunlit kitchens, where a single lamp warms the whole room, and where a woman at last has learned how to stay with herself. The media estimates Julia Roberts' net worth at around $250–300 million. But for her, that number has never defined the essence of wealth. Her language is the language of paradises, the Point Dume home in Malibu, where her children grew up under the same sunlight that once illuminated their mother's red carpets. The Taos Ranch, where she and Daniel Motter exchanged vows, still standing as a symbol of love and serenity. San Francisco was only a brief chapter. Hawaii, a closed memory. Each property is a story, not a trophy, but a refuge for laughter, breath, and safety. Most of her assets are placed in trusts, not to conceal, but to protect her family's peace in a world that's endlessly curious. Yet even within that cocoon of stability, darkness still lingers. At 57, Julia still carries the wounds of time, the silence of losing her father too young, the fractures of childhood that taught her both fragility and strength, the passing of her half-sister, leaving a wordless void, and even smaller losses like burying the family dog, a piece of her children's early memories in the garden. For her, no amount of fortune can shield the heart from loss. Pain can only be softened by love. Julia has never measured wealth in money. To her, it lives in the morning coffee on the porch, in dinners, where no one is a star, only family, in the sound of Hazel, Phineas, and Henry's laughter, a music she treasures more than any title. To the world, she remains a movie icon. to herself, she has finally found home. And though she fiercely guards her privacy, she has never closed her heart to the world. She speaks out for the environment, education, and gender equality. She donates quietly when disasters strike, never seeking the spotlight, only meaning. As she once said, "I wasn't given a star to promote myself, but to honor the world." On Finding Your Roots, when she discovered distant ties to the Mitchell family line, she smiled not because of status, but because she understood a name or bloodline is just a fragment. What defines me is the love I sow every day. Julia's legacy, therefore, stretches far beyond the screen. Professionally, she was the first woman ever to earn $20 million for a single role, a milestone that changed the conversation about equality in Hollywood. But her greatest victory didn't come from contracts. It came from emotion. The smile that was once mocked in her childhood has become a global symbol, a reminder that true beauty lies not in perfection, but in the strength refined through gentleness. Today, Julia lives mostly in Malibu with Daniel and their 3 children. The kids are grown now, but she still shields them from intrusive attention. She still returns to Taos whenever her heart needs peace. She still steps onto the red carpet when there's a story worth telling. But the compass of her life has shifted. "My life is mine," she once said, a simple statement, yet a quiet revolution in self-ownership. The girl who once trudged through snow and torn shoes now walks barefoot on the grass. The young woman who once pawned her father's watch to survive now sees time as a companion. She no longer races against it, she walks with it unhurried and proud. The woman who once feared she might never have a place to belong has built a home that nothing can shake. The story of Julia Roberts is not only about the films we remember, but about the vitality we learn from her. That a broken beginning can still lead to peace. That even the most beloved person in the world can fall yet rise again softly but steadfastly. Her legacy is not just her roles, but her proof that pain can turn into light. And that light through the smile of Julia Roberts still shines quietly into every heart, a gentle flame that will never go out.